What if the real scandal in this divorce isn't what was said, but who didn't react at all? Because while Kenya Moore appeared visibly shaken, emotional, and raw, Marc Daly's calm, almost zen-like silence has set the internet on fire. No tears, no chaos, no dramatic clapback, just calm. And in the world of celebrity breakups, calm is suspicious. So here's the question everyone's afraid to ask. How does one person look emotionally shattered, while the other looks like he already moved on 3 seasons ago? Social media detectives are working overtime. Body language experts on TikTok are slowing down clips frame by frame. X is screaming, he checked out years ago. Meanwhile, Kenya's vulnerability has people asking whether she was fighting alone for a marriage that had already ended behind closed doors. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear, this is satirical commentary, not a courtroom verdict. But satire or not, the contrast is loud. One breakdown, one poker face, and suddenly, what looked like a private split feels like a full-blown public mystery. So was this really a sudden breakup? Or are we watching the moment when 2 emotional timelines finally collided on camera? Stay with me, because this story, it gets way messier from here. When people talk about celebrity divorces, they usually focus on what was said in court filings or what showed up on Instagram first. But this situation didn't explode because of paperwork or captions. It exploded because of contrast. Because while one person looked like she was emotionally unraveling in real time, the other looked so composed that it almost felt scripted. Kenya Moore didn't just announce a separation. She appeared to feel it publicly, visibly, painfully. And Marc Daly didn't rush to match that energy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't over-explain. He didn't perform grief for the cameras. And somehow, that calm became the loudest thing in the room. Let's rewind for a second, because none of this exists in a vacuum. Kenya Moore has always worn her heart on her sleeve. For years, viewers watched her talk openly about abandonment, trust issues, and the deep desire to finally build a stable family. Her marriage to Marc wasn't just another celebrity relationship. It was framed as a personal victory, a chapter that was supposed to rewrite old wounds. When she spoke about love, she spoke like someone who had waited a long time to feel chosen. That's important because when that kind of emotional investment starts cracking, it doesn't do so quietly. Marc, on the other hand, always presented differently, reserved, measured, less interested in the spectacle. From early on, fans noticed the imbalance in how publicly invested they seemed. Kenya talked about us, Marc talked about privacy, Kenya leaned into vulnerability, Marc leaned into boundaries. At first, that contrast was sold as balance. Opposites attract, fire and ice. But over time, what looked like balance started to look like distance. People forget that emotional detachment rarely arrives overnight. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors. It slowly removes itself from conversations, from arguments, from future planning. And when viewers look back now, they're noticing the moments that didn't make sense at the time. The missed appearances, the uncomfortable silences, the way certain conversations seemed one-sided. None of it was dramatic enough to trend on its own, but stitched together, it paints a picture of 2 people slowly drifting out of sync. So when the divorce finally became public, the reaction wasn't shock, it was recognition. Kenya appeared hurt not just by the end of the marriage, but by the realization that she might have been the only one still emotionally present for a long time. Her expressions weren't just sadness. They looked like grief mixed with disbelief. The kind of look someone has when they realize they were fighting a battle the other person had already left. And Marc's calm response? That's where the speculation went into overdrive. Because calm in situations like this is rarely interpreted as maturity. It's interpreted as detachment. People started asking uncomfortable questions. Had he already processed the end privately? Had he emotionally checked out long before the public ever caught on? Was his silence a sign of respect, or a sign that he had nothing left to say? Social media did what it always does. It filled in the gaps. Clips were replayed. Old interviews were dissected. Every neutral expression was turned into evidence of emotional distance. Every tear was framed as proof of imbalance. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about a divorce. It was about timing, about who was grieving now, and who had already done their grieving years ago. What made this even more intense was the way power dynamics were discussed. Kenya is a public figure whose life has been documented and debated for over a decade. Marc is successful, but private. Fame brings scrutiny, but it also brings vulnerability. When one partner lives in the public eye and the other doesn't, emotional labor often becomes uneven. One person explains, the other withdraws. One performs strength and pain for millions. The other protects silence. Over time, that difference can turn into resentment, especially when problems are handled behind closed doors but judged in public. There is also the reality of long-distance strain. Different cities, different routines, different worlds. People romanticize independence, but emotional connection requires presence, not just intention. And when presence becomes inconsistent, misunderstandings don't explode, they accumulate. They sit quietly until one day, everything feels heavy all at once. That's the energy many people say they see now in Kenya's reaction. Not just heartbreak, but exhaustion. What's interesting is how quickly the public chose sides, even without facts. Some see Kenya as someone blindsided, left holding emotional weight alone. Others see Marc as someone unfairly villainized simply for not performing pain the way audiences expect. And that's the real tension here. Are we reacting to reality or to the story we're conditioned to recognize? In celebrity culture, tears equal truth and silence equals guilt. But real relationships don't always follow viral logic. Still, it's hard to ignore the feeling that these two people were no longer living in the same emotional timeline. Kenya seemed to be fighting for repair, for acknowledgement, for reassurance. Marc seemed to be protecting peace, distance, and control of narrative. And when those priorities clash, love doesn't usually survive. It just fades until one person finally says what the other has already accepted. As the dust settled, the divorce stopped looking like a sudden collapse and started looking like the final step in a long emotional separation. A separation that played out quietly behind cameras while the public focused on surface-level moments. Now, those moments are being reinterpreted with new meaning. Every calm response looks colder. Every emotional reaction looks heavier. And the gap between them feels wider than ever. What makes this story stick isn't scandal in the traditional sense. It's the discomfort of recognizing a dynamic many people know too well. Loving harder than the other person. Holding on longer. Realizing too late that you were alone in the effort. That's why Kenya's pain resonates. And that's why Marc's calm unsettles people. Because it suggests that while one heart was breaking, the other may have already moved on emotionally, waiting for reality to catch up with a decision made long ago. And as this realization settles in, the conversation only grows louder, the interpretations sharper. And the next layer of this story begins exactly where this moment leaves off, because once that emotional gap became visible, people started digging not for answers, but for patterns. And patterns are dangerous things when you're dealing with a story that already feels unfinished. Suddenly, every past moment was relabeled as a clue. That dinner scene that felt awkward back then, now it's proof. That interview where Marc seemed distant, now it's confirmation. Kenya's emotional openness, once criticized as too much, was rebranded as someone quietly screaming for connection while being met with silence. Whispers began circulating about what was allegedly happening behind the scenes. Not courtroom facts, not signed documents, just the kind of anonymous chatter that thrives in the gaps between public appearances. People close to the situation claimed the marriage had been emotionally over long before the official separation. According to these unnamed insiders, conversations had turned transactional. Logistics replaced intimacy. Schedules replaced affection. The relationship they said, had shifted from partnership to coordination. And that shift happened so gradually that only one person seemed to notice how far things had slipped. And here's where the narrative took a sharper turn. Because some sources didn't just describe emotional distance, they described emotional imbalance. Kenya, they claimed, was still investing, still trying, still initiating conversations that went nowhere, still attempting to fix something that the other party no longer saw as broken, just finished. Meanwhile, Marc's calm demeanor wasn't the result of sudden acceptance. It was the result of preparation. Allegedly, he had already made peace with the ending in private, while Kenya was still negotiating hope in public. Public reaction exploded the moment that idea took hold. Fans weren't just watching a divorce. They were watching what they believed was a delayed emotional collision. One person arriving at grief late, the other arriving early and waiting. Comment sections turned into amateur psychology forums. Everyone became an expert on emotional withdrawal. Silence was diagnosed. Calm was pathologized. And Kenya's tears became both evidence and currency, proof that she cared more, loved harder, and therefore lost bigger. But then came the counter-narrative, the quieter, less viral one. The argument that Marc's calm wasn't cruelty, but restraint. That not everyone processes loss through visible pain. That emotional privacy doesn't equal emotional absence. Supporters of this view argued that the public had confused composure with indifference, and that Marc was being punished not for what he did, but for what he didn't perform. No speeches, no dramatic statements, no public breakdown. In a culture addicted to spectacle, that absence became suspicious. Still, the imbalance in visibility kept tipping the scales. Kenya's pain was easy to empathize with because it was visible. It asked nothing from interpretation. Marc's internal world, on the other hand, required imagination, and imagination tends to favor drama. The less he said, the more people filled in the blanks. And those blanks were rarely generous. They were filled with assumptions about control, detachment, and emotional neglect, whether fair or not. As the noise grew louder, so did the claims of leaked information. Screenshots that proved nothing. Messages without context. Stories from friends of friends who allegedly witnessed cold exchanges and unresolved arguments. None of it was verifiable, but all of it was shareable. The story became less about truth and more about momentum. And the momentum was clear. This wasn't just a marriage ending. This was a narrative about one person being left behind emotionally. What added fuel to the fire was the discussion around power and timing. Kenya's fame meant her vulnerability was always amplified. Every reaction was magnified, analyzed, monetized. Marc's distance from the spotlight insulated him. That difference made people uncomfortable. It felt unfair. One person exposed, the other protected. One person bleeding in public, the other untouched by the spectacle. Whether intentional or not, that imbalance shaped public sympathy. Then there was the money talk. Not numbers, not contracts, just the insinuation that financial independence and emotional independence often move together. Speculation suggested that Marc's stability allowed him to detach earlier, to feel less fear about walking away. Kenya, emotionally invested and publicly intertwined, had more to lose, not just personally, but narratively. When a relationship becomes part of your identity, ending it feels like erasing a chapter of yourself. That kind of loss doesn't happen calmly. Observers began reframing the divorce not as a failure, but as a mismatch in emotional pacing. One person grieving in real time, the other having already passed through those stages privately. And when those timelines finally intersect, the collision looks brutal. It looks unfair. It looks like one person collapsing while the other stands still. But standing still doesn't mean unaffected. It just means unseen. Yet the internet doesn't reward nuance. It rewards villains and victims. And the longer Marc remained composed, the more he was cast into the role of the unbothered antagonist. Memes appeared. Sarcastic captions questioned how someone could look so calm while their partner looked devastated. The implication was clear: if you're not hurting visibly, you must not be hurting at all. Meanwhile, Kenya's narrative deepened. Her emotional expressions were no longer just reactions. They were interpreted as revelations. Each appearance felt like another layer of truth spilling out. Viewers didn't just see sadness. They saw betrayal, abandonment, and the pain of realizing you were alone in your hope. That's a powerful story, especially in a culture that values emotional authenticity. And so the scandal, if it can even be called that, evolved. It stopped being about who did what and became about who felt more, about whose pain was legible, about whose silence felt louder than words. The divorce itself almost faded into the background as the emotional contrast took center stage. Calm versus collapse. Distance versus desperation. Acceptance versus resistance. At this point, the situation no longer belonged to the people living it. It belonged to the audience consuming it. Every new detail, real or imagined, was filtered through the lens of that original contrast. And as long as that contrast remained unresolved, the story refused to settle. Because people weren't just watching the end of a marriage. They were watching what happens when two emotional realities finally collide in public, and realizing that the fallout doesn't come from the breakup itself, but from discovering that one person had already said goodbye long before the words were ever spoken. And with that realization hanging heavy, the story pushes forward into its most volatile phase yet, where speculation turns into consequence, and the pressure of public judgment begins to reshape everything that comes. Since public judgment takes control of a narrative, it stops observing and starts demanding outcomes. And that's exactly what happened here. The conversation shifted from what went wrong to who should pay for it. Calm was no longer neutral. It was treated as evidence. Silence wasn't privacy. It was framed as strategy. And suddenly, Marc's composure became the center of a completely new accusation. That emotional detachment isn't just a personality trait. It's a calculated move. Speculation reached a new level when online commentators began floating the idea that this divorce wasn't just emotionally uneven, but strategically managed. Theories emerged claiming that Marc had been preparing for the public fallout long before it arrived. Allegedly, boundaries weren't just emotional, they were legal. People whispered about advisors, quiet consultations, and contingency plans put in place while Kenya was still trying to repair the relationship. Again, no proof, no documents, just the kind of storyline that feels believable enough to spread. And once it spread, it stuck. The phrase already moved on took on a life of its own. It wasn't just about romance anymore. It was about control. The idea that one partner had accepted the end privately meant they entered the public phase with an advantage. Less shock, less fear, less emotional exposure. And in the court of public opinion, that advantage looked suspicious. People don't like asymmetry when it comes to pain. They want suffering to be shared equally, displayed equally, performed equally. When it isn't, they assume manipulation. At the same time, Kenya's visibility continued to work against her in ways no one openly acknowledged. Her honesty made her relatable, but it also made her vulnerable to overinterpretation. Every word she spoke was treated as a confession. Every emotional moment became a headline. Instead of being allowed to grieve, she became content. Her pain was replayed, slowed down, analyzed, monetized. Sympathy came with strings attached because the audience didn't just want to understand her hurt. They wanted it to lead somewhere, accountability, consequences, a villain. That's when talk of repercussions began. Not legal in the traditional sense, but reputational. People speculated about business relationships cooling, about social circles choosing sides, about silence being remembered long after statements are forgotten. In celebrity culture, perception becomes currency, and narratives decide who pays. Marc's calm, once seen as dignity, started being framed as emotional negligence. Kenya's vulnerability, once criticized, was reframed as truth-telling bravery. The balance of sympathy tipped decisively. Some even suggested that this divorce would redefine how both are seen moving forward. Kenya, the woman who loved openly and lost publicly, now positioned as someone audiences feel protective over. Marc, the man who kept his composure, now viewed through a colder lens. Not because of confirmed actions, but because of emotional contrast. Because in a story this charged, feeling less becomes synonymous with caring less, whether that's fair or not. What's ironic is that amid all this noise, the actual people involved said very little. The louder the internet became, the quieter reality stayed. There were no explosive interviews, no dramatic exposes, no last-minute revelations that tied everything together. Just a growing gap between what people believed they knew and what could actually be proven. And that gap is where fictional certainty thrives. As weeks passed, the scandal narrative began to exhaust itself, but not resolve itself. That's the thing about emotionally driven stories, they don't end cleanly. They fade, interest shifts. Another headline takes over, but the labels stick. Kenya's emotional breakdown becomes a defining moment. Marc's calm reaction becomes a permanent footnote. Even if both move on privately, the public version of events freezes them in those roles, and maybe that's the real fallout here. Not courts, not finances, not official consequences, but the way a moment gets crystallized and replayed until it defines how people are remembered. One reaction becomes a character trait. One silence becomes a motive, and the complexity of two humans navigating the end of a relationship gets flattened into a digestible storyline. In the end, there's no final reveal, no hidden tape, no smoking gun that proves anyone right. Just a collision of emotional timelines that happened in front of an audience trained to judge, not wait. Kenya felt the ending when it became public. Marc may have felt it long before, or maybe he felt it differently. But the internet doesn't ask how you feel. It asks how you look while feeling it. So the drama lingers, not because of new information, but because of unresolved discomfort. Because people see themselves in the imbalance. In loving longer, in leaving earlier, in realizing too late that two people were no longer standing on the same emotional ground. That's why this story refuses to die quietly. It isn't about divorce papers. It's about the unsettling idea that sometimes the loudest heartbreak happens when one person is already at peace, and the other is only just beginning to understand that the ending they're mourning has been someone else's reality for a very long time, and now the question goes straight to you. Because stories like this don't live or die on headlines, they live in the comments. Was this really a sudden emotional collapse? Or were we watching the final moment of a breakup that had already happened in silence? Do you believe calm is maturity? Or is it proof someone checked out long ago? And when one person grieves publicly while the other stays composed, who do you think actually lost more? This isn't just about Kenya Moore or Marc Daly. It's about how relationships end in real life versus how we expect them to end on camera. About how pain gets validated only when it's visible. About how silence can look powerful, cruel, or calculated depending on who's telling the story. And let's be honest, most people have been on one side of this dynamic at least once. So I want to hear your take. Drop your thoughts below. Whose reaction felt more real to you? Who do you think emotionally left first? And do you think the internet is being fair or just hungry for a villain? If you want more deep dives that question the narratives you're being fed, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next story might look simple on the surface, but the truth is always messier underneath.